The flatbed arrived on a Wednesday, which was already the wrong kind of day. Corbin Whale had been underneath a '94 Silverado since 6 in the morning, his back flat against the cold concrete, a flashlight clenched between his teeth, when he heard the air brakes hiss out front. He didn't move right away. He finished tightening the last bolt on the exhaust manifold first. Because that was the kind of man he was. The kind who finished what he started, even when everything outside was making noise. When he finally rolled out from under the truck and stood up, he saw the flatbed idling at the edge of the lot. The driver was a young guy, maybe 25, chewing gum with his window down, holding a clipboard out like it was something Corbin was supposed to want. "Whale Automotive," the driver said. "That's me. Got a delivery. 12 watch movements. Property of Aldgate Precision." He said the name the way people say the name of a company they've never actually been inside, like it was printed on a building somewhere, and that was enough. Corbin took the clipboard. He read it twice. He looked at the flatbed, where 12 wooden crates sat strapped to the deck, each one stenciled with a lot number, and the word void stamped in red across the top. He hadn't ordered anything. He signed anyway, because something in the weight of those crates told him he was supposed to. That was 14 months ago. The story, if you could call it one, started long before that. In a different city, with a different version of Corbin Whale, one who wore a badge and carried a briefcase and sat in meetings where men talked about tolerances in millionths of an inch, like they were talking about religion. He had been a senior mechanical engineer at a precision manufacturing firm in Detroit, the kind of place where the parking lot filled up at 6:30 and didn't empty until 8 at night. He'd spent 11 years there. He knew the equipment the way surgeons know their instruments, not just what each piece did, but what it sounded like when something was off by a fraction. His wife, Dana, had died 3 years before the flatbed showed up. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in April, gone by November. They had a daughter, Penny, who was 7 when it happened and 10 now, small for her age, with her mother's habit of going quiet when she was thinking hard about something. After Dana died, Corbin had stayed in Detroit for 8 months. Then he hadn't been able to anymore. He put the house on the market in February and drove south with Penny in the passenger seat and everything they owned in a trailer behind them, following nothing in particular until they crossed into Tennessee and the mountains came up on the right side, and something in his chest unknotted, just slightly, for the first time in almost a year. They stopped in a town called Harlow Crossing, which had a population of around 4,000 people and a main street that still had a hardware store and a diner and a barber shop with a striped pole that actually turned. There was a garage on the edge of town that had been empty for 2 years, a former owner who'd retired and moved to Florida and wanted nothing more than to be rid of the lease. Corbin talked to the landlord on a Tuesday and signed papers on Thursday and had his tools in the building by Friday afternoon. Penny started school in September. She made one friend, a girl named Bex, who had red hair and talked enough for both of them. Corbin rebuilt the garage's electrical system on evenings and weekends and paid himself almost nothing for the first 6 months, and it was fine because he'd put enough away in Detroit to survive being fine for a while. The town noticed him slowly. A man who'd worked at a place like that, come down here to fix half-ton trucks and lawnmowers. It struck people as either sad or suspicious, and he'd learned to let them land wherever they landed without explaining himself. He was not unhappy. That's the thing that's hardest to explain about that first year. He was not unhappy. He was something quieter than that, something without a name that felt like standing in a field after a storm, air still sharp with ozone, everything very still, you yourself still standing. The 12 crates sat in the corner of the garage for 3 days before he opened one. Inside, packed in foam and tissue paper that had yellowed at the edges, was a pocket watch movement. He didn't recognize it immediately. He had to clean the surface with a soft cloth before he could read the markings, Aldgate Precision, Cal, 77A, serial number stamped into the back plate. He held it up to the light from the window and turned it slowly. The balance wheel was frozen. The mainspring was almost certainly gone. The jewels were clouded with what looked like decades of oxidized oil. It was, by any reasonable measure, a wreck. He set it on the workbench and opened the second crate. Same condition. And the third. By the time he'd opened all 12, he had 12 movements laid out in a row on the long steel work table, each one frozen, each one marked void, each one apparently abandoned by a company that had, as best he could tell from a quick search on his laptop that evening, shuttered its domestic operations 18 months ago and moved manufacturing overseas. He didn't know why they'd been sent to him. He called the number on the shipping paperwork and got a disconnected tone. He sent an email to the address on the invoice header and received an automated reply that bounced back undeliverable. Penny came in from school while he was still sitting at the work table, backpack over one shoulder, and looked at the movements lined up under the fluorescent lights. "What are those?" she asked. "Watch parts," he said. "Are they broken?" He looked at them for a moment. "Yeah. Can you fix them?" He didn't answer right away. He picked up the first one again and turned it in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the density of a thing made to last a century that had simply been given up on before its time. "I think so," he said. He started on a Saturday morning in October, with the first movement clamped gently in the holder he'd machined himself from a block of aluminum the week before. Penny was at Bex's house. The garage was quiet, except for the radio in the corner, playing something soft and country that he wasn't really listening to. He had no formal training in watchmaking. What he had was 11 years of understanding tolerances at a molecular level, a collection of tools he'd spent 3 evenings ordering online, and a memory that could hold the geometry of a mechanism the way other people hold a melody. The balance staff on the cal, 77A, was snapped. He found that within the first hour. The mainspring was oxidized and brittle and would have to be replaced entirely. 3 of the 7 jewels had cracked, probably from being stored without the right humidity control. He made a list, methodical, the same way he'd always approached a problem. What exists? What is missing? What can be repaired? What must be replaced? He ordered parts over the course of 2 weeks from 3 different suppliers, 2 of them in Switzerland, one of them a small outfit in Ohio that specialized in vintage American movements and answered their phone on the second ring. By Thanksgiving, he had the first movement running. He timed it against a reference signal for 3 days before he was willing to call it accurate. It gained 4 seconds per day, which for a movement of this age and condition was, by any objective standard, extraordinary. He told no one. He started on the second movement the following week. In December, a woman came into the garage about a transmission problem in her Lexus. Her name was Ingrid. Not the Ingrid from the name list. This was a different woman entirely. A woman who'd moved to Harlow Crossing from Nashville 2 years ago and ran the real estate office on the corner of 3rd and Main, and had a way of asking questions that made you feel like she was genuinely interested in the answer, which Corbin had learned by then was rarer than it seemed. Her name was actually Vivienne Holt. He'd learned that later, that she'd gone by a shortened version of a middle name since college, and almost nobody called her by her first name anymore. But that first day she was just the woman with the Lexus and the transmission problem, and she sat in the plastic chair by the window while he ran the diagnostic, and she read something on her phone and didn't try to make conversation. He respected that. When he handed her the estimate, she looked at it for a long moment without reacting, then looked up at him. "You know what you're doing," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've been doing it a while." "You used to do something else." He looked at her. "Most people did." She almost smiled. "Fair enough." She came back 3 days later for the car. She didn't ask what the watches were, though he could tell she noticed them. The second movement was on the work table, partially disassembled, laid out in the organized grid he used to keep track of components. She glanced at it and then looked away. And he appreciated that too, the discipline of not asking about things that weren't your business. He completed the third movement in January and the fourth in March. By April he had 6 finished, 6 still to go, and he'd developed a rhythm. Evenings after Penny was in bed, Saturday mornings before the garage opened, sometimes Sunday afternoons if the weather was bad and there was nothing else pressing. He hadn't told anyone about them because there was nothing to tell yet. They were just mechanisms. Extraordinary mechanisms, yes. He'd done enough research by now to understand what the cal 77 actually was, which was a movement that Aldgate Precision had produced in limited quantity in the late 1980s for a line of watches that had never made it to market before the company ran into its first financial difficulty. The production run was small. The movements had been warehoused. At some point they'd been written off. At some point after that, apparently, they'd been shipped to him. He still didn't know why. He'd stopped trying to find out. What he knew was what they were worth, approximately, to the right buyer. A collector, a boutique watchmaker, someone who understood what it meant to hold a movement that had never been cased, never worn, manufactured to a standard that the industry hadn't required since before most people in the hobby had been born. He'd seen one Cal 77 come up at auction the previous fall. It had sold in worse condition than his worst example, for $42,000. He had 12 of them. He did not allow himself to calculate this out loud. Not yet. The problem arrived in May, the way problems always arrive. Through someone you trusted. His parts supplier in Ohio, a man named Cutter, who'd been in the business 30 years and knew more about American vintage movements than most people would learn in a lifetime, mentioned the movements to a contact of his. Casually, he said later. Over the phone, he hadn't thought anything of it. The contact was a man named Aldous Vane, who ran a private dealership in Chicago that specialized in high-value horological assets, which was a formal way of saying he bought and sold rare watches and movements to people with money and a taste for things that were difficult to obtain. Vane had a reputation in the community, the kind of reputation that sounded respectable until you looked at it sideways and noticed how many of his clients were anonymous and how many of his transactions went through holding companies registered in places that didn't ask questions. Vane called Corbin in the second week of May. He was polite. He was very knowledgeable. He used the correct terminology, and he didn't talk down to Corbin the way collectors sometimes talk down to people they assumed were just mechanics who'd stumbled onto something they didn't understand. He offered $40,000 for all 12 movements, as is, no paperwork, delivered to a location he would specify. Corbin said he'd think about it. He didn't think about it. He called Cutter back that same afternoon. "Tell me about Aldous Vane," he said. There was a pause on the other end that lasted exactly long enough to be meaningful. "He's a buyer," Cutter said carefully. "I know he's a buyer." "Tell me the rest." Another pause. "There have been questions," Cutter said, "about provenance, about where certain items go after they leave his hands." Legal questions? The kind that don't quite become legal questions because the right people never quite ask them loudly enough. Corbin sat with that for a moment. "Thanks, Cutter." Don't sell him anything you wouldn't want to read about later. He didn't sell to Vane. He also didn't hear back from Vane, which made him more nervous than if Vane had called again. In June, someone broke into the garage. They didn't take any of the shop equipment. They didn't touch the register, which had less than $80 in it. They went directly to the back room, where Corbin kept the movements in a repurposed tool cabinet with a combination lock, and they'd cut the lock with bolt cutters and opened the cabinet, and found nothing, because Corbin had moved the movements to a fireproof safe in the closet of his bedroom 2 weeks earlier, after the call from Cutter had settled into something that felt less like caution and more like necessity. He reported the break-in. Deputy who responded was a young man named Birch, who took notes and looked around and said he'd file a report and didn't seem particularly troubled by the fact that whoever had done it had known exactly which cabinet to go to in a back room that wasn't visible from the door. Corbin fixed the broken window and replaced the lock. He also installed a camera system over the next weekend, 4 units covering every angle of the interior and exterior, motion-triggered, cloud-backed. He told Penny someone had broken in but that nothing was taken and she didn't need to worry. She looked at him with her mother's eyes, the ones that went quiet when they were doing math, and said, "Okay, Dad," and went back to her book. He finished the last movement in late July, 14 months after the flatbed had arrived. He sat at the work table that evening with all 12 laid out in front of him, each one running, each one timed, each one documented with photographs and notes and a record of every part he'd replaced or restored and why. He'd spent in total approximately $9,000 on parts, tools, and reference materials. He estimated, something over 400 hours of his own time. He looked at the 12 movements under the fluorescent lights of his garage in a town of 4,000 people in the Tennessee mountains, and he understood, quietly and without drama, that the thing he'd been given, the strange cargo from a company that no longer existed, the gift that had arrived with no explanation on the wrong kind of day, was worth something that would change the shape of his life. He called Vivian that night. She answered on the 3rd ring. "I need a real estate attorney," he said. "Not for real estate, for something complicated." A pause. I know someone, she said. What kind of complicated? The kind where someone may try to claim something that isn't theirs. Another pause, shorter this time. I'll make a call in the morning. He thanked her. He sat for a moment after he hung up, in the quiet of the garage with the radio off and the mountains dark outside the windows, and he felt something he hadn't expected. Not relief, not yet, but the particular calm that comes before a hard thing you've decided to do anyway. The attorney's name was Meredith Farr, and she was exactly the kind of person Corbin would not have predicted to find in a town like Harlow Crossing. Sharp, unhurried, with the kind of legal instinct that comes from having been surprised before and not wanting to be surprised again. She reviewed the shipping documentation, the invoice header, the serial numbers, the auction records, the history of Aldgate Precision, and the paper trail, or rather, the absence of a paper trail, connecting Aldous Vane to the movements, and she gave Corbin her assessment over coffee in her office on a Tuesday morning. The movements were yours the moment they were delivered with your name on the paperwork, she said. Aldgate Precision ceased to exist as a legal entity 22 months ago. There is no successor company with a valid claim. You received them, you invested significant labor and capital in restoring them, and you have full documentation of both. And Vane? She looked at him steadily. Mr. Vane is someone you should not engage with directly. There is currently an active federal inquiry. I can't tell you more than that, into the movement of certain high-value horological assets through intermediaries. What I can tell you is that whatever arrangements he had in mind for your movements, they were not arrangements that would have ended well for you. Corbin nodded. Who sent them to me? She set down her cup. Someone at Aldgate before the company closed, who wanted them to go somewhere safe. Whoever signed that shipping order understood that the movements would be written off, that no one would look for them, and that the person receiving them would be someone unlikely to sell them quickly through the kinds of channels that Vane monitors. Someone who knew me, or knew of you. He thought about that on the drive home. He thought about the 11 years in Detroit, the people he'd worked with, the ones who'd moved on to other things and the ones who'd stayed until the industry reshuffled them. He had a short list by the time he pulled into the driveway. He never confirmed it. Some things, he decided, didn't need to be confirmed. He sold the movements over the following 6 months, through Meredith's office and a reputable auction house in New York that specialized in horological estates and asked the right questions and accepted the documentation without hesitation. The first movement sold in September, the second and third in October to different buyers, one in Connecticut and one in London. By March, he had sold 9 of the 12. The remaining 3 he placed in a different auction, one with a higher minimum and a longer preview period, and they went in April to a collector in Japan who'd been looking for a complete set of Cal 77A movements for 4 years. The total after the auction house's commission and Meredith's fees and the taxes that Corbin paid in full and on time without being asked was slightly over $1.5 million. He did not tell anyone in Harlow Crossing what had happened, except for Vivienne, who already knew, and Cutter, who called him when the first auction listing went up and said simply, "Good man," and hung up. He kept the garage. He kept the tools. He drove the same truck he'd been driving for 6 years, which needed new brake pads and a wheel bearing on the passenger side rear, which he did himself on a Saturday morning in November, while Penny sat in the plastic chair by the window doing homework. She looked up at one point and watched him work for a moment. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, Bex says her mom says you're rich now." He looked out from under the truck. "Bex's mom talks a lot. Is it true?" He thought about it. "We're okay," he said. "We were okay before, too." Penny considered this. "Okay," she said, and went back to her homework. He went back under the truck. The mountains were gray outside, and the radio was on low, and the garage smelled like oil and cold air, and something familiar he'd never quite been able to name. The particular smell of a place where things were taken apart and put back together until they worked again. He tightened the last bolt. He finished what he started. That was enough.